I think there have been multiple times on this podcast where we've sat in this very room discussing some various issue and said, I bet if Jim Delany was here, he could fix this.
Yeah.
Well, we've gone straight to the source, and Jim Delaney's here, so we're about to solve all the problems. Longtime commissioner of the Big Ten, former Tar Heel basketball player, double Carolina graduate. Thanks so much for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Catch folks up on what you're doing currently.
Yeah, well, I retired in January of 2020, so I've been in Nashville since then. And I've enjoyed retirement. We like Nashville a lot. We were there for a decade before I went up to the Big Ten in '89. My wife worked there for the Tennessee, and she was a writer, and then went to law school there. So we have a lot of friends, and Nashville's still recognizable, but it's experienced a lot of growth in the last 3.5 decades. But, we're good. I started a consulting company in 2020 and have half a dozen or so clients. I've worked with some people in different parts of the industry as well as the media. And so that's been good. It's something to do. It's not overly time-consuming. And I learned one thing: it's a lot easier to give advice than it is to make decisions.
We have a lot we'd like to talk about. Obviously, Tar Heel basketball, Big Ten, everything.
Sure.
College athletics looks different, so different now than even when you retired from it retired from your role at the Big Ten a couple years ago. I'd just be interested, I guess, in kind of your state of the union of college athletics and where it is and where we're going.
That's a big question. I'm really only here for about 45 minutes, and I don't want to, I don't want to take up too much time with a single answer. But there are a number of important inflection points over the last 5 years. Probably most consequential was the Supreme Court decision in June of 2021. And that was the Alston case, in addition to the O'Bannon case result. It really cleared the way for NIL payments to students, and it limited the NCAA from regulating grants and aid that were related to education. That hasn't really had much of an impact, but clearly the NIL has been had considerable impact over the last 3 years. And also, I think the elimination of any residency associated for eligibility purposes with a transfer. Mm-hmm. And I think those two things have really scrambled the situation. And we're working through that now, not necessarily in the courts or Congress, just the schools among themselves trying to work with plaintiffs' attorneys to try to figure out a settlement over what could be damages in a variety of cases that have been filed. So lots of movement of players, lots of NIL, name, image, and likeness, some of which I think, you could reasonably call market-based or fair market value.
Sure.
Probably, and it's hard to say this because there's not a lot of transparency. Everything that you really know is secondhand. Nobody's seeing contracts, and nobody is at the site or venue when the discussions are happening. But I would assume an awful lot of the NIL is not fair market value. It's more akin to, come here or stay here, and here's financial consideration. Now, that's a hard thing to sustain or support, but I do think that's probably the reality, unless there are hundreds of coaches and hundreds of athletic directors and hundreds of even students who would just be wrong on it. So pay for play has not been authorized by the NCAA, nor has it been required by the courts. But I think under the aegis or under the umbrella of NIL, you could conclude, and I think reasonably, that prospects as well as enrolled students are being paid to stay or to come.
So how do we make sure that college sports doesn't just become pro sports light?
Well, I don't know if whether the genie's out of the bottle or the toothpaste is out of the tube. I think theoretically, the hope would be that they could settle some of these legal cases. They could create an environment where the schools are making the payments, not boosters or third parties, unaffiliated, kind of affiliated, but unaffiliated, if you know what I mean. And that students should be able, I think, under the law and probably under some belief of fairness, could do NIL. But NIL needs some definition around it. To me, it's an exchange of fair market value between a person who's going to do a service or provide a product in exchange for consideration from a person or a company sort of independent of school boosters. So and I don't think anybody that I know of, given the Supreme Court case, the O'Bannon case, objects to that. And it's just morphed very quickly this way. And I think it's probably an indication of why the rule book was as thick as it was and as detailed as it was, because in the highly competitive enterprise, water flows downhill and competitive people fill up the environment with efforts to achieve their purposes. But I don't think the authorization of NIL was ever conceived as a way for boosters to put money into a collective in order to maintain rosters or move people from the portal into their institution. But I think I don't think it's not a stretch to say that's what's occurred.
Is there a way? Is there a reasonable way forward in this, in your mind?
I don't know. Like I say, opinions and advice are easy. The plaintiffs and the defendants have worked out a tentative proposed settlement. It's in front of the judge now.
Right.
And it conceives of the institutions making payments of a percentage of defined revenues, tickets, and the gate, tickets, sponsorship, and TV. And it doesn't say who the designated recipients are, so each school could figure that out for themselves, I guess. It doesn't really speak to Title IX. Schools are going to have to deal with that themselves. The plaintiffs' attorneys don't care much about that issue. That's our issue, not their issue. And the judge, I think understands that there's some real NIL out there. I'm not sure she fully appreciates what percentage of it is, or whether or not she cares.
Right.
But for those of us who've worked in this environment over the decades, we know that some system of a level playing field needs to be the quid pro quo if we're going to. And so, for 100 years, these universities have tried to exercise control over their athletic program, sometimes effectively, sometimes ineffectively. But the word institutional control is known to everybody as a indication that the university is running its program. But if substantial amounts of money are being used to influence recruitment and transfer and stability, and it's not from the institution, but rather from supporters of the institution, the question is there institutional control, or is it a boosterism that has existed before, but clearly now in a much more emphatic way? So the question is, is there? I think the question was, is there a reasonable way? Well, I think that's what this proposed settlement is about, and I think the defendants are suggesting that institutions share revenue with players, and the institution makes a decision how that occurs. So that is a step towards institutional control. Also, that NIL is okay, but it needs to be real NIL, what I would describe as fair market value. And there are ways to factually do that. I'm not saying it's simple, but when Nick Saban or Snoop Dogg or somebody else, Coach Prime, I mean, there's a price associated with them appearing in commercials. Nike has a series of endorsed product. Michael has a shoe, and Steph has a shoe, but everybody doesn't have a shoe.
Right.
Somebody, and if there's a local car dealership that has a series of relationships where somebody supports their product and they make a payment, but it's not $1 million. It's not that, because I think that there's quite a bit of information in the Players Association at the NFL and in the NBA and MLB about what these transactions look like.
Sure.
And so while they probably don't want to get into the details, I mean, we already get into enough trouble getting into the details of transactions. But generally speaking, I think there's got to be a mechanism for transparency and then an assessment made about whether or not these are fair market value transactions or whether there's something else.
There are two behemoths in college sports right now. There's the SEC and there's the Big Ten, of which you know more about than anybody.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a sustainable model for them to be significantly far ahead of most everyone else?
Well, a little history is in order here, because the College Football Association, I think you remember that organization
Sure.
in the 70s and the 80s, and that was the ACC, the SEC, the Southwest Conference, the Big Eight, sued the NCAA because they wanted the schools and conferences to have the TV rights. And they were successful. The Big Ten and Pac-12 opposed that. Notre Dame was in favor, SEC, ACC, et cetera. And that's called the College Football Association. And they were successful by a vote of 7-2 at the Supreme Court. And Byron Wizard White was in the minority in that case. And, he was concerned because he said, once you put commercialism right next to education, I'm paraphrasing, commercialism is going to overwhelm education. Okay, so what happens? Fast forward. For a long time, the 5 or 6 or 7 conferences were operating. We're about in the same ballpark. Although there was some expansion, Penn State to the Big Ten, and I think the Pac-12 picked up Arizona and Arizona State, and the SEC picked up South Carolina, Arkansas. The ACC really picked up a good portion of the Big East. So everybody's positioning themselves in order to become stronger and become more viable. And for a long time, it was probably throughout the 90s pretty much, because there was early only one entity that was significantly involved in college sports, and that was ESPN. And they seemed to keep everybody kind of in the same category, same zip code. But, then I don't know if it was a result of a lot of different factors. The Big Ten and the SEC separated themselves, partially because of expansion, but also partially because of brand strength, size of university, size of alumni base, size of markets. And ultimately, that led to a very significant separation in the value of media rights. So I think it's fair to say, if you look at this from the beginning, the NCAA controlled it. All the rights were in the center, and they were allocated out. And a lot of colleges, including the ACC, the SEC, and others, objected to that. They thought giving TV to the 1AAs or the Ohio Valley Conference was not right, that they wanted to control it. And they won. They were successful. And so probably the three big winners are Notre Dame, the Big Ten, and the SEC. So now there are people who don't like that. And so they're looking at, well, how can we become more mainstream? How do we find more resources? How do we take from someone or figure out a methodology for getting back to a place where there's more control? Well, I think the answer to that is somewhat short. Well, you got what you asked for. You just don't like the results.
When you said, guys, I think we can have a whole TV network that only is going to show our conference's games.
Mm-hmm.
What were people's reactions to that, and why did it work?
Well, it hadn't really. Others had done it. We watched the ESPN model, which is basically advertising plus subscription. And my judgment was, I thought if somebody could do it, we could do it because of the brand strength and the demographics of our conference. And I'd been around long enough that presidents and athletic directors were willing to try. And ESPN objected, but they didn't think we could do it, but we did. And it was, great branding. It was a great way for Olympic sports, women's sports, football and basketball to get on the air. And it was successful both financially and artistically. But it was well ahead. I mean, the SEC got a deal done with ESPN 8 years later, and ACC 13 years later. And the Pac-12 network never really got off the ground from a distribution and financial perspective. So, we were fortunate, but I think we were different in the sense that we had a conference that had been around for 100 years. And so there was a lot of known rivalry there. I think we had a great partner in Fox who let us develop our own brand. It wasn't branded Fox, it was branded Big Ten. Mm-hmm. And, we did it kind of the old-fashioned way. I mean, we weren't on the air for a year, except for a little DirecTV. So a lot of people don't want to do that. They don't want to go through that. They'd like to have their own network. They'd like to have the finances, and they'd like to have the branding. But it was quite an ordeal. I could tell you that. You could read about it, but it was difficult. But it was successful. And that did two things. It opened up a huge financial gap with others. Because and it introduced Fox into the environment, so now you have multiple bidders. And eventually, they bought half of the Big Ten, and eventually they bought more than half. And then eventually CBS and NBC came in too. Meanwhile, we were getting larger. I mean, in my time, we expanded with Maryland and Rutgers, Penn State, and Nebraska, and then subsequently the LA market with Hughley and Southern Cal, because we were doing well, and people wanted to join. Mm-hmm. They wanted to be part of it. And we thought, I thought, I only got to 14, so I can't speak for 16 and 18. But, Texas and Texas A&M wanted it in. And I'm sure that schools in the Big East wanted into the ACC. So everybody has been participating in this at one level or another, but I think the real lesson is that, commercialism that was asked for by our universities and conferences, not everybody, but most everybody, won. NCAA lost control. It went to the conferences. The conferences became the more powerful entities. And then in Notre Dame, of course, it's got its own brand, and it's been uber successful. And, they have enough leverage to be in the ACC and have football independence. Mm-hmm. That kind of deal wasn't available to us. It would have been very hard for me to have a deal. I mean, that's not the way Penn State or Ohio State or Michigan would feel about it. But they've done that before, and they do that now, and, they're strong enough to do that. So I know that a lot of people now are suggesting, we need to do a super league, or we need to do this, and we need to do that. The question would be, well, what was wrong with NCAA controls in the first place? What about the schools what about the conferences that disappeared?
Right.
And so is it convenient now to say that schools, because schools are mostly interested in themselves and their survival. That's where the fan base is. That's what the president does. That's what the AD does. And then secondarily, they're interested in their conference, and they want their conference to be successful. And if their conference isn't successful, what do? They look around to see how they can become successful away from their conference. Mm-hmm. So that's pretty much a natural phenomena, I think. And the way I see it, and I've worked with all different size conferences in Division I. First obligation is to school, second obligation is to conference, and third obligation is to the broader community. And that's pretty much, I think, been the story of intercollegiate athletics, especially since that Supreme Court case of Board of Regents in 1984. So I don't know exactly where it all lands. I do think the first step is some sort of settlement, and then it would be nice to get some help from Congress. I don't know if that will happen or not. They're very busy in Washington these days with much, much bigger fish to fry. So I know more about the history than I do about the future, but I would expect that universities and conferences would continue to, presidents and communities that would first be interested in protecting themselves, and two, then the people they've been with for a long time. I mean, the relationships in the Big Ten, sans Penn State, and the new members that were starting in 1990, those relationships go back 100 years or more. And so those, whether it's, Purdue, Indiana, or Michigan, Ohio State, or Wisconsin, Iowa, those are deep. Those are deep relationships.
You've said the word brand and branding several times, and I think selfishly we think Carolina has a very strong brand.
Mm-hmm. I would agree with you. I think they do.
But they are not affiliated with one of the two current strongest brands. So where do they fit in this landscape? Can you have a strong brand and not be in one of those two?
That's a challenging question. First of all, I think Carolina gets an amazing amount of things done. Sponsored sports programs, successful students and athletes and championships for what they do spend. And I think it's partially because you have some real advantages. You have a beautiful campus, you have strong traditions, great brand, and a lot of people want to come here. I mean, it's not exaggeration to say that North Carolina, at least in some periods of time selected, didn't recruit. And I think that's probably still true in some of the Olympic sports as well. So they get an awful lot done. I saw where the ACC, I think, in their 7 fall sports, had 5 number 1 ranked teams. And that's wonderful. And they have great rankings academically. But remember what Byron White said: when you put commerce next to education, commerce is going to work. And so I'm not playing down the need for resources and revenues, but I don't have a crystal ball either about big structures or individual sort of institutions. I think Carolina is one of the more attractive programs that aren't in those two conferences. Whether or not they ever will be, I have no idea. That was within my pay grade for a long time, but it's not now.
Do you consider yourself a Tar Heel or a Big Ten guy?
Well, I sort of have a head and a heart. So I would say, I was here for 7 years, which is a good run. And I did get 2 degrees in 7 years. And I would
look. Some have gotten only 1 in 7 years. That's fine.
I understand, but I did want to clarify. And then I was with the Big Ten for 31 years, So that's probably a quarter of its history.
Sure.
And so I feel like a Tar Heel, and I also feel like a Big Ten guy. I feel like both. I'd have to say when I was playing here and we beat Ohio State, I was 100% Big Ten. But if Ohio State were playing the North Carolina, I'm not sure where I was. I was probably for the Big Ten. Well, I wanted to win the challenge.
Sure.
I would want to win the bowl games. You have pride of that you develop over time.
Was there ever a moment in that tenure where you thought you might be close to uniting the head and the heart?
I don't really. I want what's best for North Carolina. I want what's best for the Big Ten, and I think that North Carolina, along with a few others, are attractive. But whether or not it ever happens or not, I don't know. I think you could see the Big Ten and the SEC, they just met on scheduling. I had 27 years of a Big Ten ACC challenge. I love that. And we played everybody in bowls, but it's a different day and time. You all talked about the last 5 years.
Yeah.
And nobody has clean hands. Nope. Because everybody said, I want those rights. And so whatever was going to the smaller guys in the 70s or 80s under the NCTV plan, that was eliminated. And so I could say the Big Ten and the Pac-12 fought against that. They didn't think this was the right thing to do, but it having occurred, and obviously the Pac-12 is not here anymore in the way that it was. But the Big Ten is bigger and stronger, and it's under new leadership. But even under my leadership, we were aggressive.
Sure.
But the ACC was aggressive, very aggressive, and the Big 12 and the Southwest Big 12 was aggressive, and the SEC was aggressive. There's not an entity, a school, or a conference that in this new environment where the center lost control of the media and conferences picked up on it. Notre Dame's aggressive. Tell me anybody who's not aggressive, because you're responsible first for primarily in North Carolina for North Carolina.
I wish we had like another hour. I got 100 questions I want to ask, but I definitely want to ask about your playing time here. You were at Carolina at the time where Coach Smith kind of finally started getting it to where he wanted with those 3 straight Final Fours and all the different successes that he had. Can you just take us through a little bit about playing for him in those early days? What was happening with Carolina basketball and how he grew it to where it became what it is?
Well, he was a young man. When he recruited me, I don't know, he was about 35 years old maybe. And, I wasn't a highly recruited player. I could have gone to some schools, and they're now the Big East schools, but I had gone to a Catholic boys' school. My dad was a high school basketball coach. So I grew up with the game, and I thought I could play, but I wasn't a national recruit like a Charlie Scott or even Eddie Fogler. I think DeGubar was a national recruit. And so we had great players here, between Larry Brown and Billy Cunningham and Larry Miller and Bobby Lewis, but they hadn't won. They first of all had the handcuffs, a little bit in the early 60s based on NCAA probation and other challenges they had. And then Coach Smith, he took over a handicap program. I think they were 8 and 9. They couldn't play off campus. And they got, I think my senior in high school, they were 16 and 11. But they had landed Larry Miller, who was a consensus number 1 player in the country. Bobby Lewis was a third-team All-American. And, they had this group of freshmen that were a year ahead of me, and while there wasn't an All-American among them, they all could play a little bit. Rusty in particular. In fact, I always say, for my money, over all the years, Rusty was probably the most underrated Carolina player in history. Simply, he outplayed Dave Cowens when we beat them a couple times. He outplayed Bob Lanier. He outplayed Issel. He outplayed Mike Lewis over at Duke. And he's 6'11". He was smart and tough. And Grubar was a good player, a 3-year starter. Bill Bunting was a 2-year. So they were very good. Gerald was a good player, Joe Brown. So that group, got integrated with Bobby Lewis and Larry Miller. Now, I would say Larry, like Reggie Jackson, he was the guy that, he was the guy that made it happen. He had great chemistry, great leadership, great competitiveness, and was fun to be with. And so when I was a freshman, that team came and they won the ACC tournament in the regular season and the Eastern Regional. So that's the first time it happened. Then it happened again my sophomore year, and we won regular in the postseason, ACC tournament, Eastern Regional. We won a game in the Final Four, and then it happened again my junior year. And so, some of the characters were changing, but the commonality with those kids who were recruited a year before me. They had Bunning could run and shoot, and was a hard guy to defend because he was like a number 4, he's 6'9", and Rusty, like I say, I thought he was very good. He didn't look that athletic, and he didn't jump that well, and maybe didn't run that well, but he could really play, could really pass, could really consistently compete, and consistency was the right word. He was always good. And he was good in the biggest games. The only one that he was clearly, dominated by was against Kareem Abdul-Jabbar in the championship game. So Charlie was a consensus All-American, and of course Larry was a consensus All-American. But Coach Smith was a young coach, but he was a prepared coach, and attention to detail was off the charts. And, I remember, the last 4 minutes of the game, which is just 10% of the game. I think we spent 25% of our practice time on the last 4 minutes of the game. So he had a lot of smart players. Charlie was a smart player. Rusty was a smart player. Larry was a great competitor. And there was a lot of internal competition. There were a lot of good players on the team that didn't play a lot. All of us wanted to play, but there wasn't playing time. My college roommate was Eddie Fogler, and he beat me out. I was trying to play more, and he was a 2-year starter. But we got along pretty good. It was a good social unit as well as competitive unit. Not that we were best friends all the time, but we lived right across the street. We lived over in Avery at the time, and it was good. It was good. Charlie Scott was a phenomenal player, and the time was an interesting time. In the late 60s. I mean, every year there was something big happening in the world outside of college sports, whether it would be on campus or whether it would be in national politics. There was a lot of violence. I think in 68, Kennedy and King were both killed in that spring. We went to the moon in 69, and in 68, that summer, Russians invaded Czechoslovakia. So there was a lot going on. But it was a good experience. We weren't very good in my senior year. We started off pretty good. I think we were like 9-1 and top 5. And we had some injuries. Some of the young kids got a little bit sick. I think Bill Chamberlain and Dennis Weisick had some mono or had some injury situations. And Charlie, I think was a phenomenal player, but better player as a sophomore and a junior. I mean, we scored so much. We were so reliant on him, and we didn't get enough. I think Dedman was sick a little bit, and we just didn't play as well. And South Carolina was a better team. They won the league that year. They were better than we were, but we didn't play up to our capability. That was disappointing. But the 3 previous years were good, and then the following year, in 71, South Carolina still won it again, and they won the ACC tournament. That was on the famous Kevin Joyce, Lee Dedman tip in the tournament. But they were good. They had bounced back. They went to New York City and won the NIT. I think they beat Duke, and they beat Dr. J at UMass. And then 72, they went to the Final Four again, and then 73 and those were David Thompson years and Maryland years, quite honestly. But then by 76, we were pretty good. 77, Final Four should probably won the national championship. And so that was sort of the period of 66 to maybe 78 that I was like most closely associated with it. I moved away from here in 75, but still, I kept up with John Kuster played for the Kansas City Kings, and I would see John around and kept up pretty close with Eddie over the years. So, a big fan and very proud to have played here.